Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Lost Fell Chronicles. Before we begin, take a second to comment where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where these forgotten pieces of American history travel in the middle of the night. Tonight's case isn't a ghost story. It isn't folklore. It's a documented, government-sealed event buried beneath one of America's fastest-growing cities. In 1914, Phoenix construction crews uncovered a series of underground chambers, machine rooms, filled with scorched metal, melted gears, and technology that had no business existing in the early 20th century. Within 48 hours, the government sealed everything in concrete. No explanations, no press coverage, no answers. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin. By the winter of 1914, Phoenix was no longer the dusty frontier town it once was. The city had exploded in population during the previous decade, and officials proudly announced a modernization project they believed would transform Phoenix into a true Western capital, a fully electric streetcar line stretching through the heart of downtown. Newspapers printed optimistic headlines, merchants expected booming business, and the crews tasked with laying track along Washington Street approached the job with the confidence of men who had done this kind of work dozens of times before. The soil beneath Phoenix was predictable, dry, sandy, and shallow. A worker could dig 2 feet with a shovel before hitting anything harder than sun-baked earth. That's why, on the morning of March 18th, when the first crew began trenching near the intersection of Washington and First Street, no one expected anything unusual. Foreman Louis Barrett stood with a rolled-up set of plans under his arm, calling out measurements, while men shoveled in rhythmic clinks of metal on dirt. It was the kind of repetitive, uneventful labor that made time move slowly. Until it didn't. At approximately 10:42 a.m., a dull, metallic thunk vibrated through the trench as worker Manuel Ortega's shovel struck something solid. He frowned, bent down, and cleared the soil with his hands. A curved surface, smooth and grey, glimmered beneath the dust. Ortega assumed it was an old cistern, or perhaps some forgotten utility line. Phoenix was known for haphazard early constructions, but when he tapped the exposed surface again with the flat of his shovel, the sound that echoed back wasn't hollow. It rang. A long, resonant bell tone that travelled through the ground. Ortega froze. Workers paused. Barrett looked up from his plans with a scowl. He expected lazy digging or a broken tool, not the strange echo that was still humming faintless through the trench walls. "Hit it again," Barrett ordered. Another strike, another bell-like note, clearer this time, deeper, almost musical. Barrett's irritation faded, replaced by something he didn't admit often: unease. He climbed down into the trench himself, brushed away more soil, and revealed what looked like a perfectly smooth, polished curve, too clean, too precise to be anything old or abandoned. "It's metal," he murmured, "but not like any tank I've ever seen." To test his guess, Barrett removed a small hammer from his belt and gave the surface a firm tap. The sound that answered was astonishing. A bright, ringing tone that vibrated long after the hammer left the surface, as if the metal were part of something much larger beneath them. The workers stepped back involuntarily. Tanks didn't sound like that. Pipes didn't resonate like that. And the ground itself shouldn't have carried that kind of tone. Barrett felt a prickle rising along his arms. He wasn't a superstitious man, but every instinct he had told him the crew had uncovered something buried intentionally, something meant to stay hidden. Still, he forced himself to regain his composure. "Clear the area," he ordered. "We dig this out a foot at a time, carefully." But as the men resumed their work, the strange metallic surface continued to widen, revealing a smooth arc that disappeared into the earth on both sides, far larger than a tank, far more engineered than any municipal record suggested. And for Barrett, that ringing tone would be the first sign that the city of Phoenix was standing on something far older and far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. By late afternoon, the strange curved surface had grown into something far larger than any of the workers expected. The trench widened as shovels scraped away layer after layer of soil, revealing a continuous arc of silvery grey metal that seemed to form part of a circular structure. The curve didn't dent, didn't rust, and didn't show a single seam. Whatever it wasn't anything built by Phoenix contractors, or anyone in Arizona for that matter. Foreman Barrett ordered the crew to widen the trench further. As they dug, Manuel Ortega's shovel suddenly punched through a weakened patch of earth. The soil collapsed inward, sending a rush of dust and sand into a dark cavity below. The ground beneath Barrett's boots trembled, and the crew jumped back as a section of trench wall gave way, revealing a vertical shaft nearly 6 feet across. The shaft wasn't crude, like an old well or drainage tunnel. It was perfectly smooth in a way that almost looked polished. The walls were made of an unfamiliar stone-metal composite, pale grey with metallic flecks that shimmered under lantern light. There were no tool marks, no joints, no rivets, no signs of construction. It looked grown, not built. Barrett cursed under his breath, part fear, part disbelief. No sewer maps showed anything like this. No mining companies ever operated beneath this part of the city, and nothing in the city's young history explained such a structure. He ordered a lantern tied to a rope, then slowly lowered it into the shaft. As the light descended, the men leaned over the rim and stared in stunned silence. Instead of a narrow tunnel, the lantern illuminated the entrance to a massive chamber, easily large enough to hold a house. Its floor wasn't dirt. It was a lustrous surface that looked like metal melted and then hardened smooth. The walls were lined with faint geometric grooves, repeating in presses, those intervals almost like blueprints carved into the stone. Barrett could feel the hair on his arms stand up. 3 men go down, he said at last, though his voice carried none of his usual command. Harnesses. Slow descent. 3 volunteers stepped forward. Ortega, young Tom Weaver, and an older miner named Brooks, who had worked every mine from Nevada to Utah. All 3 were seasoned enough not to spook easily. But when their boots touched the chamber floor, everything changed. They called up that the chamber extended far beyond what the lantern first showed. A corridor opened on its far side, tall, perfectly straight, running deep underground like a hallway built by engineers who understood precision at a level even 1914 America didn't. Embedded along the corridor ceiling were thin copper strips, arranged in parallel lines that resembled electrical circuits, delicate, intentional, and unlike anything the workers had ever seen. "What is this place?" Weaver whispered. His voice echoed strangely, as if the corridor swallowed the sound and sent it back altered. By the time the men were hauled back up, Weaver's hands were shaking. Brooks refused to speak at all. Both quit before sundown, collecting their pay in silence. Ortega stayed, but with a look Barrett had never seen in him before. Fear, tightly controlled but unmistakable. Whatever lay beneath Phoenix wasn't a pipe, or a tunnel, or a utility. It was engineered. It was deliberate, and it was not recorded in any city document. The following morning, after a restless night for anyone who had stood near the shaft, Foreman Barrett returned with a smaller crew, men he trusted, men he believed were steady enough to venture deeper, but even they worked in near silence, each shovel of displaced earth revealing more of the underground structure that had no right to exist beneath Phoenix. The shaft's corridor waited exactly as the previous day's explorers had described, tall, straight, and impossibly smooth, its ceiling lined with copper strips so thin they looked painted on. But when the new crew lowered a lantern and followed its glow down the corridor, they realized the earlier descriptions had been incomplete. The corridor didn't simply lead somewhere, it guided them. The grooves along the walls narrowed in subtle ways, their spacing tightening as the passage deepened, almost as if channeling something, air, electricity, or force, toward whatever lay ahead. Ortega, pale but determined, led the way. Every step he took echoed sharply. the sound bouncing back with a hollow metallic resonance. Then the corridor opened into a vast chamber. The men stopped where they stood. No one spoke. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the flicker of the lantern flame. The chamber was enormous, far larger than anything the workers had imagined, and in the center of the room, rising nearly 20 feet, stood a copper-wound tower, a massive coil of metal spiraling upward like the skeleton of a giant mechanical tree. The copper was flawless, brighter and purer than the wiring used in the city's modern electrical grid. Even under dim lantern light, it glowed with an unnatural sheen. At its base, the floor was scorched black, the stone fused into a glass-smooth surface. Thick gear clusters, or what remained of them, were melted directly into that surface, warped as though subjected to temperatures capable of softening. Metal like wax. "Nothing burns that hot," muttered one worker. "Not coal, not oil, not even dynamite." But the chamber had burned. On the far wall, a massive black stone panel dominated the surface. Unlike the surrounding stone-metal walls, this panel was untouched by heat. It was carved with geometric diagrams, spirals, intersecting lines, evenly spaced nodes, arranged with such mathematical precision that Ortega whispered it looked like a map drawn by a machine. No one recognized the symbols, no one recognized the stone, and no one could imagine who or what built it. Then Ortega felt it. A vibration beneath his boots, subtle, rhythmic, like the soft thrum of distant machinery slowly spinning down. He placed his hand on the nearest wall. The surface was cold, yet it vibrated, tiny pulses traveling through the stone in patterns too regular to be natural. "Something was running here," he whispered, barely audible. Barrett stepped back instinctively, as if the metal might start moving again. The men had seen enough. They climbed the shaft as fast as they dared, hauling themselves out into blinding sunlight with expressions that quickly drew a crowd of curious onlookers. But Barrett shoved everyone back. "No one goes down again," he barked. Within the hour, Phoenix police arrived. By sundown, the entire street was blocked off with barricades. Officers stood guarding the trench with rifles, turning away anyone who approached. The city called it a safety hazard. But for those who had seen the chamber, the coil tower, the melted metal, the carved diagrams, it felt like something else entirely. Not a hazard, a secret. And the ground beneath Phoenix was not done with them yet. By sunrise, Washington Street looked nothing like a streetcar project anymore. The barricades were doubled, police presence tripled, and the air itself felt heavier, thick with the tension of men who had been ordered to keep their mouths shut without being told why. Foreman Barrett expected Phoenix City officials, maybe even territorial engineers, to arrive and demand answers. Instead, black automobiles rolled in just after dawn, vehicles dusted from long travel, their engines still warm. Out stepped men every worker instinctively recognized as outsiders. Their coats were too sharp, their hats too stiff, and their silence too deliberate. They identified themselves not by badge, but by tone. U.S. Bureau of Mines. A federal agency with jurisdiction over mineral studies, mine safety, and apparently anything that wasn't supposed to exist. The government men spoke in clipped phrases, always in pairs, notebook in hand, though they never seemed to write anything down. They ordered the workers away from the trench and demanded every tool, shovel, rope, and lantern used near the shaft. A few men protested, saying those tools belonged to the company. The agents simply replied, "Not anymore." Workers gathered in uneasy clusters as the feds sealed the trench with canvas tarps and posted armed guards. Barrett tried to speak with the man who appeared to be in charge, a tall, grey-eyed official with the rigid bearing of a military officer, but he was cut off mid-sentence. "We'll take it from here, Foreman. Your men are no longer needed." "No longer needed for the day?" Barrett asked. "For the site," the man replied, staring hard. "Permanently." By mid-morning, each worker was ushered toward a row of folding tables, where bureau officials handed out thick envelopes, cash, far more than any of them were owed for a single week's labor. The message was clear: no contracts, no signatures, just money. And forgetfulness. Some men took the payment with trembling hands. Others refused, only to find the envelope pushed insistently into their palms. The youngest worker, Ortega, hesitated the longest. "Is this a bribe?" he asked quietly. The agent nearest him leaned in. "This is closure," he replied. "Be wise enough to accept it." Behind them, 3 investigators descended into the shaft, with equipment none of the Phoenix crew recognized. Coiled cables, insulated crates, something that looked like a portable generator, but hummed with a frequency no one had heard before. Hours passed. Not a single federal worker emerged. When they finally did, the expressions on their faces said enough. Whatever they had found was worse, or stranger, than the Phoenix crew had imagined. In a private exchange Barrett overheard, 2 agents spoke bluntly, unaware or uncaring that he stood nearby. "Electrical in nature," one muttered. "Function unknown," the other replied. "System incomplete." The words hung in the air like dust motes, both harmless and horrifying. That afternoon, more rumors spread. Quiet, uncertain but persistent. A city surveyor claimed the underground chamber aligned perfectly with 3 locations across Phoenix where, early in the city's founding, construction mysteriously halted due to unstable ground. Unstable, or already occupied. Whispers now suggested the shaft beneath Washington Street was not unique, that 3 more tunnels had once existed, and that someone, long before Phoenix was built, had collapsed them deliberately. As darkness fell, the feds closed the site completely. The workers went home, envelopes of cash tucked deep in their coats, carrying not just money, but a silence the government clearly intended to last forever. By the second night, the trench no longer felt like part of Phoenix. Flood lamps surrounded the perimeter, humming generators filled the air with a constant mechanical growl, and armed federal officers paced the barricades with the tension of men guarding something they didn't understand, and didn't want anyone else to understand either. Just after midnight, a convoy rolled in from the rail depot, 3 flatbed trucks carrying equipment covered in thick canvas tarps. The Bureau of Mines officials signed nothing, spoke little, and allowed no one near the vehicles except a small team of specialists, men who dressed more like laboratory researchers than geologists. The specialists worked fast. They attached insulated cables to steel winches, assembled unfamiliar devices made of copper plates and glass vacuum tubes, and lowered them carefully into the shaft. From the street, residents watching from behind police lines saw only the glow of lamps and the silhouettes of men hurrying back and forth. But underground, something far stranger was taking place. The first device, a metal cylinder with a latticework surface, was lowered into the machine room. When it reached the chamber floor, one of the specialists flipped a switch. The cylinder crackled with blue sparks, and the faint thrum beneath the worker's feet intensified, not violently but rhythmically, like the heartbeat of a dormant machine stirred awake. A second device followed, then a third. None of them resembled mining tools. None belonged to 1914 Arizona. Up on Washington Street, residents awakened by the commotion gathered at their windows. Around 1:17 a.m., the streetlights, newly installed electric lamps Phoenix was proud to boast about, began to flicker. First a quick dimming, then a full pulse that rolled down the street like a wave. "Transformer issue," a policeman muttered. But the power plant reported no issues. At 1:24 a.m., the ground itself began to tremble, not like an earthquake, but like the vibrations from a colossal engine buried deep below the desert. Glass rattled. Tools clanked where they hung in sheds. Dogs throughout the neighborhood began barking uncontrollably. Some residents described a pressure in their ears, like standing next to a massive telegraph generator. Then the humming began. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, seeping through the ground, humming through walls, shivering through wooden floorboards. A long, sustained note, metallic and almost melodic, like a tuning fork the size of a building being struck again and again. It continued for nearly an hour. At 2:16 a.m., just as suddenly as it had begun, the humming stopped. Lights steadied. The vibrations ceased. The night air went eerily still. The specialists emerged from the shaft minutes later, their faces pale under the harsh lamp glow. One of them whispered something to the lead agent. Barrett didn't hear the words, but he saw the man's hands trembling as he held his equipment case. By dawn, the site was swarmed with federal personnel. Men carrying clipboards inspected the ground. Others hammered wooden stakes for boundary markers. The specialists conferred quietly among themselves before the chief official finally made an announcement. "The site is unstable," he said. "Immediate burial is necessary for public safety." He didn't elaborate. He didn't invite questions. But the look in his eyes betrayed something Barrett had never seen in a federal official. Fear, not of collapse, not of litigation, but of what they might have awakened. By sunrise, Phoenix no longer had a mystery beneath its streets, at least not one the government intended the public to remember. Federal officials moved with a level of urgency and coordination that Foreman Barrett had never seen in his 30 years of construction. Orders were barked, documents sealed, and workers shuffled away before they had time to ask questions. The same men who had been quietly studying the machine room only hours earlier now acted like men trying to bury a crime scene under the desert. 3 supply trucks rumbled up to the barricades before breakfast, hauling rebar cages, thick steel plates, and fresh mixed concrete. No surveying teams arrived, no university scholars, no museum curators. Not a single journalist was allowed within half a block. The entire operation had one goal: erase everything. The first step was filling the shaft. Workers, those who hadn't already quit from fear, were ordered to lower bundled rebar lattices into the vertical passage, reinforcing it like the skeleton of a fortress wall. As the first forms clattered into the darkness, Barrett noticed something that made his stomach twist. The vibrations from the chamber were still faintly present, not enough to shake the street, but enough to feel through the soles of his boots. The federal supervisor noticed it too. He didn't comment. He only sped up the burial schedule. Barrels of quick-setting concrete were rolled forward, hoses uncoiled, and a portable pump began blasting slurry into the shaft. The grey mixture cascaded downward like a manufactured waterfall, splashing against the chamber's unseen floor. After the first few tons, the strange undercurrent of vibration softened, muted, as if the machine below were being smothered one breath at a time. By noon, the shaft had swallowed more concrete than Barrett believed possible. Then came the steel. Large rectangular plates, re-lowered over the opening, 5 inches thick and stamped with serial numbers Barrett didn't recognize. Welders sealed the seams with a precision that suggested this wasn't their first time burying something they didn't want unearthed again. Within an hour, the plates glowed with heat, desert sun, and something else radiating upward from the depths. Workers stepped back. Supervisors pretended not to notice. Finally, the order came to bring in the backfill crews. Truck after truck dumped sand, rock, and compacted gravel into the trench, burying the steel caps beneath thousands of pounds of desert earth. The streetcar company wasted no time reclaiming the project. Rails were dragged into place, tamped into the new fill, aligned, and prepared for installation. The message was unmistakable. Whatever had been under Washington Street was never meant to be accessed again. By late afternoon, City Hall issued their official statement, a single sentence typed on thin paper and hand-delivered to local newspapers. A natural sandstone cavity was encountered, no significance. No mention of the metal shaft, no mention of the machine room, no mention of the heat, the humming, the diagrams, the experiments, the federal agents. Just a quiet dismissal. A cavity. Nothing more. Foreman Barrett read the statement twice and felt a cold, heavy pressure settle in his chest. He knew what he had seen. Every man on that crew knew, and now the government wanted the world to forget it had ever existed. As the first test streetcar rolled over the newly buried chamber, Barrett felt the faintest tremor beneath the railbed, like something far below the city shifting in its sleep. The erasure was complete, but whatever was down there wasn't gone. Only hidden. Henry Rios was not the kind of man anyone expected to become a threat to federal secrecy. He was quiet, meticulous, pale from years spent indoors, and known mostly for his habit of correcting filing dates no one else cared about. As the junior archivist for the city of Phoenix, his world revolved around paper, maps, utility surveys, dusty holdings from the territorial days. But in September 1914, 6 months after the burial of the machine room, a batch of documents arrived that should never have crossed his desk. A clerk from the Bureau of Mines brought them in mistakenly, or perhaps carelessly, mixed in with routine streetcar construction records. The folder was thin, labeled only with a date and a single word: Washington. Inside were 4 memos stamped restricted in red grease pencil. The first memo was brief, 5 words that froze Rios in his seat. Power, traces detected during excavation. Rios read it again, heart pounding. Power? From where? The site had supposedly been nothing but a collapsed sandstone cavity. Yet here was an internal report stating otherwise. He turned to the second memo. Resonance anomalies confirmed. Source not geological. Rios felt a prickle along his skin. He had read enough seismic reports to know the word resonance wasn't used lightly. Something down there had been humming, vibrating, before they entombed it. The third memo was longer, typed cleanly, clinical in tone. System appears part of wider grid. Unknown extent. Recommend immediate suppression and termination of investigation. A grid. Buried beneath Phoenix. Rios stared at those lines until his vision blurred. The implications were staggering. This wasn't an isolated chamber. It was connected, possibly to other rooms, other devices, maybe other cities. Something ancient, engineered, and deliberately hidden long before Phoenix existed. The fourth memo was the most alarming of all. 3 short sentences. Unauthorized sketches recovered from workers. Retrieve remaining copies. Enforce silence. Rios felt a cold sweat rise. Workers had drawn the machine room before being paid off and silenced, and someone had gone after those sketches aggressively. He should have closed the file, sealed it, and walked away. Instead, he photographed everything. In the dim basement archive, using a borrowed box camera, he captured each memo, each signature, each diagram. He tucked the developed photos inside a hollowed-out atlas and hid the original memos in the false bottom of a filing cabinet, labeled Canal Flow Rates, 1899. Over the next week, Rios quietly tracked down 2 workers from the original excavation. Both refused to speak. One trembled. The other warned him, voice hollow. Whatever was down there, it wasn't meant for us. And they're not done with it. Still, Rios persisted. He collected whispered details, traced names on requisition logs, and gathered a handful of saved sketches. Copper-wound coils, stone panels covered in impossible geometry, and a diagram of what looked like an energy channel running north-south beneath the city grid. He kept everything hidden, until the day he vanished. On March 3, 1915, Rios failed to report to work. By noon, 2 men in grey suits were seen entering his apartment. By dusk, his entire home had been emptied. Drawers, shelves, even the floorboards pried up. Every book he owned was gone. Every photograph, every memo, every sketch. No police report was filed. No missing person notice posted. Henry Rios simply ceased to exist. And with him, the last surviving evidence of the machine room's connection to a hidden, forgotten grid beneath the American Southwest. For most of Phoenix, Washington Street is just pavement, traffic, and heat shimmering off the asphalt. But to the men who work beneath it, sewer crews, electricians, streetcar repair teams, the ground has never behaved like ordinary earth. The earliest anomaly was recorded informally in 1922, when a sewer foreman named Lawrence McBride reported something he called a mechanical pulse. He felt it first through his boots, a steady rhythmic thrum, faint but unmistakably patterned, like a slow engine turning somewhere deep below the concrete. He reported it. The city clerk dismissed it. The pulse returned every few years. Then came the winter anomaly. Phoenix doesn't get much cold, but in 1931, maintenance worker Sam "Red" Tillman noticed that a section of the street above the sealed chamber was warm to the touch, even on nights when frost formed in nearby yards. When he mentioned it to his supervisor, the response was immediate. Don't ask questions underground. By the 1940s, more reports surfaced, none official, all quietly circulating among the crews. Men fixing sewer lines saw a faint blue glow leaking through hairline cracks in the old concrete culverts. Electricians swore they heard metallic echoes when they tapped certain walls, as if hollow machinery lurked just beyond the reach of their lights. A city geologist brought in to examine tremors in 1954 claimed the vibrations did not align with known fault structures, then abruptly rewrote his own findings 2 days later, calling them settling noises. No one believed him, and no one wanted an explanation, because by then, the workers had an unspoken rule. If something feels wrong under Washington Street, keep moving. The city archives contain no official mention of these events, no notes, no damage assessments, no geological surveys. But the oral history among crews is consistent. Something beneath Phoenix has never stopped operating. Not fully, not completely. In the 1970s, things escalated. A man only identified as FR, an equipment technician, stole a small copper fragment from a ruptured sewer wall near the buried chamber. He claimed the metal scrap had been part of an embedded track or coil. It was unusually smooth, unnaturally polished, and showed no corrosion despite being buried for decades. He mailed it anonymously to a metallurgical lab in Los Angeles using a fake return address. The results came back within 2 weeks. Copper purity above 99.997%. Grain alignment consistent across the entire sample. No impurities typical of early 20th century smelting. Microstructures impossible to produce in the US before the late 1930s. One line in the lab report stood out. This object was manufactured using techniques consistent with high-frequency refinement or induction methods not documented before WITU. In other words, whoever built the tunnel, the coil tower, the stone metal walls, they were working with a level of precision decades ahead of 1914 America. Rumors spread that the machine room wasn't an isolated artifact at all. Some crews whispered it was a converter. Others said it was a relay. A few believed it was a node in a much larger, now buried continental system, stretching across the southwest. A technology not invented by early settlers. Not compatible with indigenous engineering. Not matching Spanish colonial records. Something older, or something erased. Whatever the machine room once powered or connected to, still murmurs beneath Phoenix, still pulses, still warms the ground, still hums to itself in the dark. Waiting. By the late 1960s, the story of Phoenix's buried machine room had mostly faded into rumor, half-whispered tales told by retired streetcar workers and 1 or 2 surviving descendants of the original 1914 crew. But in the shadows of academic circles and the basements of fringe researchers, the story was far from dead. What began as urban legend quietly evolved into something more disturbing, a theory supported by a growing pile of evidence, Old maps, metallurgical samples, engineering anomalies, and patterns of suppression that spanned decades. The Phoenix chamber, they argued, was not a one-off discovery. It was a node, a part of something far greater, a system that predated Phoenix, perhaps even the United States itself. It started with a historian named Ruth Delaney at Arizona State University. She specialized in early territorial surveys, and in 1971, while reviewing engineering drawings from before statehood, she noticed something strange. Unexplained voids marked on hand-drawn city plans, voids that aligned perfectly with where the 1914 construction crew had broken into the underground shaft. A second void appeared 3 miles east, another near the Salt River, all identical in size, all sealed, all undocumented. Delaney took her findings to a retired city engineer, Reuben Maddox. He laughed at first, until she showed him the measurements. Maddox went pale. He had worked for the city in the 1940s and remembered blueprints stamped "withheld by federal order." He had always assumed they related to wartime civil defense, but the dimensions matched. "Whatever's down there," he said quietly, "it was connected." This continued for years. Pockets of truth drifting toward each other like magnets in the dark, slowly forming a pattern no one wanted to acknowledge. Then came the breakthrough. In 1983, a metal scrap surfaced at a private collection auction in Flagstaff, an odd Kurz. Ved fragment, allegedly smuggled out by a worker who ignored the 1914 payoff. The seller's grandfather had kept it hidden for nearly 70 years. The fragment was small, no bigger than a hand, but it was unmistakable. Its composition was analyzed by an independent metallurgist in California. The results should not have been possible. Copper purity, 99.9994%. Impurities, negligible. Crystalline alignment, engineered, not natural. Heat treatment, unknown, not replicable, using 1910s methods. For comparison, the United States did not achieve comparable copper purity until 1938, and even then, only in small quantities for specialized electrical components. Yet this fragment had been buried under Phoenix in 1914, or far earlier. The metallurgist wrote one final note in his report, circled twice. "This is not a primitive artifact." The conspiracy researchers took the data and ran further than any academic would dare. They proposed the network theory, built on 4 key pillars. 1. The chambers beneath Phoenix were designed as power relays, transfer points in a system moving energy from one node to another. The copper-lined ceilings acted as conductors, possibly part of a wireless system that predated Tesla by centuries. The machine rooms were too symmetrical, too precise to be random or isolated. The engineering implied a continental blueprint. Whoever built them understood electricity at a level impossible for known civilizations of the Southwest. Not a scattered culture, not a local tribe, a system-building civilization, possibly erased, or erased on purpose, long before American maps reshaped the land. The Phoenix chamber wasn't the whole story. It was just the first crack in a buried grid stretching far beyond the desert. By the 1990s, the machine room incident had slipped into obscurity, filed mentally next to ghost stories and lost mines, a curiosity told around campfires and late-night radio shows. But Phoenix had grown. The desert had become a sprawling modern metropolis, and with expansion came something no one expected, a new wave of anomalies that revived a century-old fear. It began at Arizona State University, where a small group of geophysics students, working late in an unused lab, decided to run ground-penetrating radar scans along Washington Street for a class project. They had no intention of uncovering buried secrets. They were simply testing budget equipment borrowed from a construction firm. But the first scan produced a void exactly where historical rumors placed the 1914 chamber. The odd part wasn't the void. It was the movement. When they ran the scan again, same spot, same equipment, the void had shifted 8 feet to the west. A third scan, taken minutes later, showed the anomaly deeper. A fourth scan placed it closer to the surface. Geology doesn't behave like that. Rock doesn't rearrange itself. Sand doesn't compress in cubic shapes. And underground cavities do not drift beneath a modern city. Yet the scans insisted exactly that. Something beneath Phoenix was moving or phasing in ways the Earth should not allow. The students quietly shared the results with the professor. By morning, their project files were gone. By noon, the equipment had been reclaimed by the firm that loaned it. By evening, the students were told to select a new assignment. Unofficially, of course. At the same time, Phoenix residents began reporting something stranger. Electrical pulses felt through the soles of their shoes during thunderstorms. Not lightning strikes, not transformer surges, but pulses rising from below. Short, evenly spaced, mechanical in rhythm. One resident described it this way, like a slow heartbeat under the pavement. Local folklore revived almost overnight. Old men at barbershops muttered that the chambers weren't abandoned, only hibernating. Retired electrical workers recalled voltage spikes during monsoon storms that didn't match any pattern known to APS grids. And some long-time downtown residents claimed they could sense a low hum after heavy rainfall, like something underground was waking, then going dormant again. By 2008, enough anomalies had accumulated that two independent researchers risked everything by publishing a small, self-funded paper online. Their conclusion was blunt. Phoenix sits atop a manufactured system, not of our era, and not of our design. The fallout was predictable. Ridicule, mockery, swift discreditation. But privately, people kept talking, and the same whisper survived. The machine rooms weren't abandoned. They were shut down. By whom? For what purpose? No one dares answer. Because the government's behavior in 1914 suddenly makes sense. They didn't bury ruins. They buried a warning. Something they believed the public should never interact with again. Something that should never be activated, repaired, or even studied. Today, long-time residents say that if you stand near Washington Street during a winter storm, when the clouds lower and the air tastes metallic, you may feel the ground hum, very slowly, like the heartbeat of a sleeping machine. A machine waiting for instructions it will never receive again. And that brings us to the end of tonight's investigation. What do you think lies beneath Phoenix? An ancient energy grid? A forgotten civilization? Or a technology our own government feared too much to explore? Let me know your theory in the comments below. I read every one of them. If you enjoyed tonight's mystery, make sure to like and subscribe for more forgotten American histories every week. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe beneath the lights.